Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. In today's episode, we'll speak with David Pratt, former Minister of National Defense, about the upcoming Washington Summit, the resemblance between today's international security environment with Putin in Ukraine, China, and the rise of other revisionist powers, and that of the build-up to the Second World War, and the significance of this moment in world history. We'll also discuss the response of NATO to the ongoing war in Ukraine. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through events, research, and publications. This is the Expert Series. David, thanks so much for joining the Institute today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Maybe we can start with your recent piece you penned for the Institute, which is also the title of this episode. Is history rhyming? You draw parallels between Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine and Adolf Hitler's aggression in Europe, particularly highlighting Putin's justification of the 2014 Crimea invasion as akin to Hitler's Sudetenland crisis. You also argue that Putin's denazification claim is a facade meant for domestic consumption, while his motivations and methods mirror those of the Nazis. You also suggest that the current geopolitical situation involving Russia and its allies against Ukraine and NATO could lead to wider conflicts, which raises pivotal questions for Western leaders akin to those faced by the Allies in the Second World War. So, for our listeners, could you build on this description, perhaps touch on the thesis of your article, and explain the most important takeaways of your piece? Is history rhyming? The Putin-Hitler analogy, Ukraine, and Euro-Atlantic security.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Josh, and it's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I think the basis of the essay is certainly that Putin's denazification argument that he had used as his reason for his aggression in Ukraine is really a bogus argument. It's a smokescreen, actually, intended for domestic Russian consumption. And I think the supreme irony here, when Putin talks about denazification, is really, if we look at his actions in Ukraine over the last number of years, dating back actually, almost 15, 20 years now. If we look at his actions, there's a real convergence, I would say, with the motives and the modus operandi of Hitler in the mid to late 1930s. So that's the essential, I guess, the core part of the argument. But what I try and demonstrate as well is that with a Hitler-like actor on the international scene, that it does raise the possibility of what I describe as cascading conflicts, which is a common phrase where in political science, at least, where the outcome of a particular conflict can actually spur other conflicts. And here I'm thinking of the example that was set back in the 1930s with you had the Japanese aggression in Manchuria in 1931. Followed by, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, the German occupation of the Rhineland, and then the Anschluss or annexation of Austria. And then, later on in 1938 with the Sudetenland crisis, which eventually resulted in, the complete absorption of Czechoslovakia by the Nazi regime. So that aspect of cascading conflict, I think, does, it presents the possibility of happening again, in the sense that if NATO fails in Ukraine, then it could embolden other aggressive actions by key players on the scene. And I'm thinking here, of course, of China's interest in annexing Taiwan. The possibility of aggression between North Korea towards South Korea, and who knows what may happen with Iran as well and its aggressive intentions in the Middle East.
Thank you for that helpful primer, David. I'd like to discuss in more depth your comparison between Hitler and Putin, and I'm wondering if we might be able to touch a bit more on some of the similarities that you see between these two figures in their geopolitical strategies, especially when it comes to justifications of territorial expansion.
Yeah. I think what we have seen, for instance, in Putin's actions in Crimea, there's some very strong similarities between that and the Sudetenland. And this was raised, back in 2014 by Hillary Clinton, for instance. She made a direct comparison, and others have made similar comparisons as well. But in both cases, I think the actions of the two leaders were based upon historical grievances regarding lost territory and a kind of a nationalist imperative to unite those speaking the same language. And the moves by Hitler, for instance, were part of what could be described as pan-Germanism, which were sort of encapsulated in the famous Nazi phrase "Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," which means one people, one state, one leader. And in other words, Hitler sought to unite German speakers in Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia to effectively reverse the effects of the Treaty of Versailles, create one large Germanic nation. So some of this was described in Hitler's famous book, Mein Kampf, as an agenda for action. So the Sudetenland came after, of course, his occupation of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria, as I mentioned. And his justification for the occupation of the Sudetenland was, of course, that the German-speaking minority in what was then Czechoslovakia were being persecuted. And I believe that Hitler even used the term genocide at the time. And so the absorption by the Nazi regime of the Sudetenland, which eventually resulted in a complete absorption of the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovak nation. It's very similar to the sort of piecemeal approach that Putin has taken with Crimea, and then with the Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk, et cetera, and in terms of the aggression that was perpetrated in 2014. So I think there are some very, very strong similarities that way. Putin has talked about, he talked about, for instance, the need to unite Russian speakers, that Crimea was really an essential part of Russia, and that it was necessary to invade Crimea to protect the interests of the Russian speakers in Crimea. So, there are some very, very similar lines of justification and the rationale and historic grievances, because you'll recall, in Putin's 5,000-word essay, he talked about the fact that, the breakup of the Soviet Union was the great tragedy of the 20th century. And I think he's in the process right now of trying to fix that and trying to restore, previous republics that were part of the Soviet Union, and in some respects to restore what was part of, if you go back a number of centuries, what was part of the Russian Empire.
Many geopolitical commentators and experts, I think, would say and have said that the era we are in right now is one of the most contentious and dangerous perhaps since the Cold War. With this said, with all these hotspots around the world, with Putin in Ukraine, with tension in the South China Sea and in the Middle East, I'm wondering if we can come back to this idea that you explore in your piece of cascading conflicts.
Yeah, well, I think that, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, and if he's able to essentially wipe Ukraine off the map as a separate, independent state, it will demonstrate a certain weakness by NATO. Because if you look, for instance, at the economic wherewithal that exists within NATO, the 32 NATO members have over half of world GDP. Russian GDP is around the same as Canada's, in that vicinity of around $2 trillion annually. So, if we are not able, if the West and NATO is not able to defeat Russia in Ukraine, I think it's going to send shockwaves around the world and embolden potential aggressors like China in relation to Taiwan. Because Chinese aggression, it's not just at this point, not just directed towards Taiwan in terms of the various Chinese exercises, military exercises that have taken place. The Chinese appear to want to turn the South China Sea into a Chinese lake, and they're infringing on, for instance, Philippine sovereignty, and they're really, really flexing their muscles in that area. And we see the same thing with North Korea and some of the things that have been done by Kim Jong in recent months and in recent years, actually, in terms of the development of missile technology and the potential for the expansion of North Korean atomic nuclear capabilities. And in many respects, some of the same things apply to Iran and its potential for troublemaking in the Middle East. So it is a very, I think it is a very difficult period for international peace and security generally. And I think much hinges on the outcome of the Ukraine conflict at this point.
I think you use these analogies to illustrate just how consequential this conflict is. We're drawing comparisons between historical figures, I think, to help frame people's minds and help them wrap their heads around what this conflict means in the current moment. So during the era of the Second World War, we had our Hitlers, we had our Mussolinis, but we also had our Churchills, right? So drawing from Churchill, his leadership and his speeches during the Second World War, David, I'm wondering what lessons there might be from your perspective that could be applied to President Zelensky, his leadership, and the broader Western response to the Ukraine war.
Well, I think there are definite parallels between Zelensky and Churchill in terms of leadership. And if you go back in history to the spring of 1940, for instance, Churchill was faced with the disaster of Dunkirk, the French surrender, and Britain and the Commonwealth basically effectively standing alone. So Churchill, through his refusal to accept any type of peace agreement with Hitler, despite Britain's incredibly weak position, and it was a supreme act of defiance in opposition to blatant totalitarian aggression and in defense of democracy in many respects. And one of the things that struck me in terms of some of the research I did for the essay was John F. Kennedy's famous comment about Churchill being able to mobilize the English language and send it into battle. And I think that's very much the case if you go back to Churchill's, portions of Churchill's blood, sweat, toil, and tears speech. Some of those lines could have been written directly for Zelensky. And I think in terms of how Zelensky has demonstrated leadership, again, his defiance in the face of Russian aggression is similar in many respects to that of Churchill. And in his speech to the British Parliament, I think in the spring of 2022, Zelensky paraphrased aspects of Churchill's blood, sweat, toil, and tears speech. And when he responded to the U.S. invitation to evacuate Ukraine, for instance, of course, his response was, "I don't need a ride. I need ammunition." And I think that with that line, I think Zelensky inspired the West and NATO to provide support. I think the problem, of course, was the slow response of NATO in terms of meeting Ukraine's needs. And I think also, obviously, Ukraine was greatly assisted by Russia's ineptitude in the early days of the invasion. And NATO, while it certainly provided, a significant amount of military, financial, and humanitarian support, it's clear that, like the situation that Churchill found himself in, that this conflict is not likely to end anytime soon. So to summarize, I think that Zelensky's leadership in these early days was similar to Churchill's and was absolutely critical in terms of galvanizing Allied support.
I think it could be said that Russia and NATO both view this conflict as existential. So that being said, how does this kind of view of the conflict as existential influence the strategic decision-making of both sides from your perspective?
Well, I think the fact that the Russians have suffered an extraordinary number of casualties is a demonstration of the extent to which they see the Ukraine conflict as existential. And of course, they've also indicated a willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons. And I think, again, that demonstrates the extent to which Russia is prepared to go to siege Ukraine and effectively wipe it off the map. Personally, I don't think the Russians are prepared to use their nuclear arsenal. And I think that my understanding is certainly that behind the scenes, the Chinese have informed the Russians that the use of nuclear weapons would be completely unacceptable. And also, I think that if Russia wants to alienate the rest of the planet and isolate itself in terms of international relations, using nuclear weapons in Ukraine would be a good way to do that. In terms of NATO's strategic decisions, I think that the slow response of NATO in terms of providing specific weapon systems such as tanks and air defense systems indicates how exceedingly cautious NATO has been. But as I think we've seen, there's been a slow ramping up of more sophisticated weapons that Ukraine has been supplied with, including NASAMS, Patriot missiles. And I think that the message that it's okay to strike targets in the border areas of Russia, which are being used for staging offensive operations, I think, again, that indicates a ramping up of NATO's desire to support Ukraine more comprehensively and I think more effectively.
How could NATO continue balancing the need for military support for Ukraine, and how did they balance that with the risk of escalating the conflict further?
I think this is a really careful balancing act for NATO. And clearly the use of NATO troops in Ukraine would be a red line for the Russians. They would see that as a reason to perhaps attack NATO countries directly. But if NATO can continue to expand its support for Ukraine and continue to bleed Russian resources in terms of military equipment and Russian forces, they may be able to create a situation where Russia absolutely has to rethink whether this is worth it. And again, if we go back to the economic issues that Russia is going to be facing, this is a significant drain on the Russian economy. And there's only so much that China and North Korea and potentially Iran as well are able to do in support of Russia. And they think that the overwhelming economic power of NATO may be the deciding factor in all of this.
While we have you, David, I think it would also be pertinent to discuss the upcoming NATO Summit in Washington next week. So, NATO Summit. What would you say are the key agenda items or concerns heading into the summit for NATO generally, but also maybe Canada in particular?
Sure. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the summit will be focused on defense spending and Ukraine, not necessarily in that order, because I think Ukraine is going to be at the top of the agenda. But the military and financial resources that NATO members can put at the disposal of Ukraine, I think, is going to be, the main item of discussion. And I think what Ukraine is looking for, obviously, artillery, air defense systems, fighter aircraft, electronic warfare systems, and I think some of the discussion will go to as well the NATO deployments on the eastern frontier with Russia and Ukraine. And that includes Canada's contingent in Latvia, certainly. But I think they'll also seek to address some of the issues around the positions taken by Turkey, by Hungary and Slovakia, some of which have been lukewarm or even non-supportive in assistance, in terms of assistance to Ukraine. And I think we'll also see perhaps some discussion around the necessity of NATO members moving more towards what I would describe as a war economy, to produce the things that are necessary, not just for their own defense, but in support of Ukraine as well. And I think it's very likely that there will be some discussion around Ukraine's application for membership in the EU and the potential path for membership in NATO. So I think those are going to be the primary topics of discussion.
I'm wondering at this moment in time how you would characterize Canada's current diplomatic or military relations with key NATO allies, especially those that have been critical of Canada's defense spending levels as of late.
Well, I think there is a recognition that while Canada has done much in support of NATO, especially with the deployment to Latvia, I think there is also disappointment that Canada is not stepping up and that we need to do more to get our defense house in order. There are lots of things in the works, obviously, in terms of major procurements in Canada, the Canadian Surface Combatant. We've got NORAD renewal on the agenda, the acquisition of the F-35, the MQ-9 and the P-8, and some other platforms as well. But we are glacially slow in our procurement processes, and we need to revamp recruitment and deal with some of the other institutional issues that have undermined, I think, our defense capability.
David, you were the former Minister of National Defence. What would you say are maybe the main obstacles in the way of Canada meeting its 2% target of GDP on defence spending, or maybe some of the obstacles in the way of getting us to increase that spending generally?
Well, I think the government has largely been focused on the domestic agenda, and there's obviously lots of issues that need to be addressed. Whether it's inflation, whether it's housing, there are so many domestic issues that are on the agenda. And unfortunately, I don't think defense spending has been seen as a critical priority. I'm hoping that will change. But I think we also lack a defense culture in this country. And that, stems from the fact that we've got, three oceans separating us from potential adversaries. And the extent to which we've also been reliant on the Americans for continental defense. The Americans have been carrying a very heavy load, and to a large extent, we've been freeloading for some time. So I think that those are the issues that need to be addressed by the government, and there needs to be a better understanding by the Canadian public of the importance of defense as well.
Ukraine and defense spending will obviously be big topics at the summit. But before I continue, I'd like our audience to know that this was recorded on June 28th, 2024, which means that the night before this was recorded, there was the televised presidential debate between President Biden and former President Mr. Donald Trump. So a lot of people are concerned about Biden's performance post-debate and what it can mean for the election. So I think Europe, Canada, and other NATO allies are now pretty concerned and are having to seriously think about the potential for a Trump presidency and what it might mean for NATO and European security. So with that said, David, how might a potential second Trump presidency impact NATO?
Well, I think if there's one thing that we have come to expect from Mr. Trump is the unexpected. So, he seems to have a view of NATO as a significant draw on U.S. resources, and he doesn't necessarily see the return on investment, and I think that's problematic. And I think perhaps the President Biden's performance in the debate last night is probably sending some shockwaves through the alliance right now, when they're considering prospect of a second Trump administration. So, I think some of the things that former President Trump has done over the course of his previous presidency in terms of his seeming affinity for authoritarian leaders, whether it's Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, and his comment that Putin could do whatever the hell he wanted with NATO members that weren't meeting the 2% guideline, I think was an astounding comment for someone who's interested again in the presidency. So I think there's going to be there's probably going to be a lot of soul searching within the Democratic Party over the course of the next few months in terms of what lies ahead for them. And I think there's going to be more focus within the alliance with respect to what a Trump presidency could actually mean.
David, thank you very much. This has been a very enriching conversation, and I'm happy to hear your analysis. It was also a pleasure reading your essay, Is History Rhyming?, which I would encourage all of our audience and listeners to read. It's fantastic. Before we close out this segment, I'd just like to ask if you have any final thoughts, if there's anything you'd like to impress on the audience that you think is important, whether that be about your piece or about the upcoming summit.
I think we've covered a lot of ground, frankly, Josh, in this. And again, I appreciate your having me for this discussion. I guess the only thing I would say is that I hope that the listeners to this podcast really understand what a critical period we're in terms of world history. Because I think what happens in the next few years in Ukraine, potentially in Taiwan, and other hotspots in the world could determine the future of democracy worldwide and just the future prospects for international peace and security. And I think that it's going to be more important than ever that we maintain allied solidarity in terms of NATO in the face of some of these challenges, and that political leaders can summon the will to do what's necessary to roll back any aggressive intentions from international figures that we have on the political stage right now.
Thanks again for joining us, David. And again, I'd encourage our listeners to read David's latest piece for us, which should be up on our website shortly. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Varner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.